I guess at that time, they're probably customs people probably weren't even that clued in to look for these things, were they?
Yeah, no, I mean, they started that in 1967, and what they would do would they would buy vehicles like in Germany, and they would drive them to Afghanistan, load them up with the hash. They became very adept at figuring out how to hide this stuff all over these vehicles and which models were better for it, you know, and had bigger panels and so forth. And then they would drive overland from Afghanistan to Karachi in Afghanistan, and they had connections with corrupt port officials there. And they would load these cars onto boats that would then be shipped back to the States. And then they would have friends that were like ex-servicemen, for example, didn't look like hippies, that had the receiving papers for these cars. And they would go pick them up. But there was one funny time, actually, that I read about in the book, where a couple of Brotherhood figures who had made this trip successfully and gotten out of the country, gotten back to the States, and were waiting for their car. They go to pick it up in Wilmington in a big Volkswagen minibus full of hash. And, you know, everything looks like it's going great, but all of a sudden they're told, you know, there's a random inspection. You guys got to drive over to this other terminal, and, you know, we'll just check it out briefly, and then you can be on your way. So they weren't brought over there in any kind of custody, though. They were told to drive their vehicle to this checkpoint, and instead they just left. They saw an empty exit and just drove out, and that was the end of that. So it's pretty lax, but, you know, that didn't last forever.
So some Leary biographers sort of gloss over his association with the Brotherhood, or then there was a point where it was almost just kind of denied, saying, well, this is a very, you know, distant relationship. But they actually raised money for him, and but before I get into the whole jailbreak thing, which I wanted to discuss, I mean, like, what was the relationship? I mean, like, did they bring him down and sort of put him as like the guru in residence, or I mean, and how many weeks are we talking about that? You know, they were around, because I mean, he was in Berkeley at some points. He was obviously at Millbrook.
Right. Well, he had been run out of Millbrook in late '66, I believe, by G. Gordon Liddy, who was a deputy DA up in Dutchess County, New York. And he already had residence in Berkeley. He had taught at Berkeley before he had gone out to the East Coast.
I've seen that house.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Are You Serious? And Queen Moo from Mondo 2000 told me that, oh, that's where Liddy used to live. It was a really nice Victorian house. And apparently he built the mailbox that he was all proud of, and he had gone up there with them. Oh yeah, that mailbox that I built. Look, it's still there. You know.
Yeah. Well, two things happened. I believe, and I talked to people that got this straight from Griggs himself, that he had actually driven out to Millbrook, and I know for a fact that they were delivering marijuana, for example, to Millbrook. The Brotherhood was smuggling it across country. So Griggs had specifically gone out there with the intention of trying to talk to Leary and tell him about all the stuff that they were doing, because Leary had famously tried to prove that administering LSD to prison inmates could somehow cure them and reduce recidivism rates and so forth. And here you had, with the Brotherhood, a group of guys that were actually performing this research on themselves.
True.
And they were such proselytizers that they went to a conference on psychedelics in, I believe it was 1967, and met with a pair of UCLA psychiatrists who were talking about mental patients and who had been coming in, you know, after taking LSD, and how it was ruining their lives and this kind of stuff. And they tried to convert these two psychiatrists to the notion that it was actually a really healthy thing to do. So they invited the psychiatrists up to Majestic Canyon. This is before they moved down to Laguna. And, you know, these guys wrote up a report that they ended up calling the bad trip. So, you know, the results that they were trying to prove weren't what the academics saw, you know. But in any case, that's how they got Leary to come out. He was curious to see what, you know, why these guys were so, you know, convinced of the magical powers of LSD, and he shared that enthusiasm, obviously. So, one person also told me that they kept Leary very, very entertained by always making sure he had a 2-pound bomber between his lips. So, you know, they were fun guys to be around for Leary. And, you know, while he didn't want to check out to some tropical island purchased with hash proceeds or anything like that, he did end up moving to a ranch up in Idlewild near Palm Springs, where all the married members of the Brotherhood, including John Griggs and his wife Carol, and several other members of the group, lived in basically a communal existence, which was what they were trying to achieve all along.
They were in like teepees there, right?
They were actually, during the summer months, living in teepees, yeah.
How long was Leary there?
And Leary was there for the better part of a year and a half, I'd say.
Oh, no kidding.
Summer of 1968 he was there, summer of '69, so that's when things started to turn for the Brotherhood, and their whole self-sufficient lifestyle started going a little bit out of control. And there were some tragic events that happened in close succession that summer, and that's when everyone left, including Larry.
Right. Well, the sort of figurehead of the Brotherhood dies.
Yeah,
John
overdose.
Griggs, the charismatic leader, dies.
Yeah, and another girl, a 17-year-old girl on acid, was swimming in a swimming hole and ended up bumping her head on the diving platform and dying. And that happened a couple of weeks before Griggs died.
So what happens? You know, there's a point where there's sort of spiritual goals, and you know, there's sort of a spiritual army out there to, you know, proselytize and change people and change their head. And at what point does it become basically a drug dealing organization where, you know, the spirituality falls by the wayside towards maybe, you know, just making money?
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of chart that problem to the inception of the group. There was always a lot of competing egos and people that were full-time smugglers in the Brotherhood, and then people that were very much just into the religious, in their mind, aspects of what they were doing. So there was this kind of conflict within the group. And Griggs managed to keep a lid on all that, and he, you know, it was his sort of supervisory role that kept everything sort of together, and he made sure that the proceeds from the drugs were shared with everybody to support Mystic Arts World, for example, to support the commune up in Idlewild. Anybody that needed anything or had any problems, you know, would just come to him, and he'd make sure that they were taken care of. When he dies, that didn't happen anymore, and the Brotherhood that they had started to sort of fall to the wayside. There were a lot of people that really thought that Griggs was out of his mind for moving in with Leary. I mean, you're talking about, these are the biggest drug smugglers in the country at this point, and they're moving in with a guy who's the most famous psychedelic countercultural, you know,
They bring a ton of heat in them.
Yeah, exactly.
It was crazy.
Right. So most of these people, even though they weren't, you know, they were still friends with Griggs and everything, they'd stayed as far away from Idlewild and even Dodge City and Laguna Beach as you can imagine. This is what led most of these fellows, since they were really into surfing, to go to Maui. And
which is another great tangent in the story. I mean, these guys were the pioneers of setting up pot farming in Hawaii, and in fact, Maui Wowie was their strain.
Yeah, the history on that's a little bit murky. You know, it's
always
hard to
is.
know
Yeah.
exactly how much credit to put on the Brotherhood itself. But yeah, I mean, they brought a huge shipment of marijuana to Maui right when all these hippies were arriving there. Their idea was, basically what happened is they got a boat in the Caribbean and they sailed it to Mexico, where they loaded it with the best quality Mexican marijuana that they could get their hands on. And then they sailed this boat, this yacht, out to Maui through these hurricanes and so forth. And I interviewed the one surviving member of that crew. Pretty intense trip. And so they get there. What they wanted to do was they wanted to sell all this marijuana in Maui so that they could raise a bunch of money that they could then use to purchase a huge amount of hashish in Afghanistan. And they were going to take the yacht all the way to Pakistan and load it up with this hash and bring it back to Maui and live out their days. The thing is, they get to Maui and they have all this pot, and they just fell in love with Maui, and they were too busy surfing and smoking pot and playing baseball and riding horses and lying around to, you know, like, remember what they were, you know, originally trying to do, and the boat just started collecting barnacles, you know. So that was the end of that, and basically they stayed there, you know, for a couple of years, and by the time they started trying to remember what they were really all, you know, trying to accomplish, the cops already knew where they were.
Yeah, those guys, again, must have stood out like sore thumbs in that context as well, because it was...
Right.
It really the change in Hawaii hadn't even happened at that point.
Well,
I guess they were pioneers of that as well.
They participated in probably the strangest, you know, thing that's ever happened anywhere in the islands, which was the filming of this movie, Rainbow Bridge.
Yes, right. Jimi Hendrix makes a strange cameo in the lives of the Brotherhood.
Yeah, that was through Mike Hinson and Mike Hinson's